On May 19th, 2024, Red Lobster, the beloved lobster, shrimp, biscuit, casual dining chain, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, which allows them to restructure their debt and prevent them from liquidating all of their assets. I probably could have made this video a month ago. That's when rumors surfaced that Red Lobster might file for bankruptcy protection. And that's when people started coming out with videos about how this endless shrimp promotion is what sunk Red Lobster, was tanking their business. In reality, that's not totally true, and then there's actually more I want to uncover and discuss in this video. I think just doing a brief overview of their history will allow us to see how they got to this point, why they filed for bankruptcy protection. Yes, the role that private equity played, and when I heard that, I was like, okay, private equity, not surprised, because these types of chains, they are bread and butter for private equity firms. They see a chain like Red Lobster, Steak and Shake, Subway, and they think it's a very easy business to understand. They've ate their food, they've been at their restaurants, they think, oh, this is the simplest thing in the world, I get it, I understand their business, I think I can make some improvements that'll make this business more profitable, when in the end, all they do is they end up selling off as many assets as possible while keeping the business afloat. And then they hopefully still sell the company for a profit, but then, by the time it gets around to the third or fourth private equity firm, there's no more assets left to sell, and you're just left with a declining business that is a shell of its former self, i.e. Steak and Shake. However, the current owner who is filing for bankruptcy of Red Lobster is not a private equity firm, but the actions, as we'll see as we discuss, of the private equity firm that owned them is really what sort of put the hole in the boat before the boat started sinking. So, like I said, let's do a brief overview of Red Lobster's history, cover their ownership, some of the details that led up to bankruptcy post-COVID, and then we'll break down the bankruptcy and where I see Red Lobster going from here. Now, Red Lobster was originally founded in 1968 by this guy, Bill Darden, in Lakeland, Florida. And that Darden name may sound familiar if you're actually familiar with Red Lobster and their business, and maybe sounds more like associated with Olive Garden, and we'll cover that in a second. But believe it or not, despite all the different acquisitions of Red Lobster over the years, Red Lobster still to this day remains headquartered in Orlando. Now, what happened with Red Lobster is sort of like somebody made one video on YouTube and it was an instant hit, and every video they've uploaded has just been a hit after that. That's kind of what happened with Red Lobster. Darden opened one restaurant, was a hit, opened a second one, was a hit, and by the time he got to his fourth restaurant, General Mills actually made him an offer to bring Red Lobster in-house, make Bill Darden an executive so he could still run the business, but had the resources of General Mills to fuel expansion. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds in this video, so we're going to kind of breeze through some of the details. But fast forward about 10 to 15 years after the acquisition of Red Lobster, and General Mills gives Bill Darden another restaurant to run called Olive Garden. Then, fast forward about 10 years later after that, Red Lobster and Olive Garden are both their own chains, growing rapidly, obviously, and Bill Darden actually dies. And it was at this point that the two chains were large enough, and a couple others, that General Mills decided to bundle those together and spin them off as their own public company called Darden Restaurants. And that's how they're still traded today, or at least Olive Garden is. And then after that, there's some other history we could cover, but once again, like I said, breezing through the details, the recession happens in about 08, 07, and obviously this casual dining segment takes a significant hit. And more so than that, the company suffered for the next several years, but by the early 2010s, I was reading about this in several articles, is that's when this whole new genre of restaurant came on. You see, like Red Lobster and Olive Garden, and really Steak and Shake for a period of time, and a couple others like Longhorn Steakhouse, filled this sort of like middle ground where it wasn't formal dining, but it wasn't fast food. They were like in the middle. They were considered what's called, or referred to in the articles that I read, as casual dining. And there was no in between. You had fast food, casual dining, formal dining. That was it. Now in the early 2010s, you had this sort of middle ground between fast food and casual dining open up, where you had this, what they call fast casual. Think like Chipotle, Panda Express, where it's not the quality of fast food, but it's not quite a sit-down restaurant. You're still, going to the counter, ordering your food. It's just faster and cheaper than casual dining, but it's higher quality food than fast food. And still recovering from the recession, Olive Garden and Red Lobster weren't doing so hot. They had declining same-store sales. The business model had structural problems in it at this point. And so Darden Restaurants decided that, hey, we've got two sinking ships. Maybe instead of figuring out what the structural problem is and keeping them both, let's offload one and try to fix the other. And at this time, Olive Garden had become the bigger brand. I think you and I all can agree on that. And so they decided to offload Red Lobster. They announced that we're going to divest of it. We're either going to spin it off as its own company or we're going to sell it. And once that announcement was made in early 2014, about 5 months later, it was then revealed that Red Lobster was going to be sold to a private equity firm by the name of Golden Gate Capital. There really wasn't anything specifically that Golden Gate did during their time that they owned Red Lobster that was an issue. But this specific transaction of acquiring Red Lobster from Darden Restaurants is really the rock that sunk the boat if you fast forward 10 years later. Because Golden Gate Capital, I was doing some reading about them, and they typically rely on fundraising from investors to finance their deals. It's not money they have in-house. So they're not really like the richest private equity firm in the world, I guess, or at least they weren't at the time. And so what they ended up doing was that they had to sell the real estate because Red Lobster owned all their locations. And so in order to finance the transaction, they actually sold 550 out of 700 restaurants, like the physical locations and the land, to this company called American Realty Capital Partners for $1.5 billion. And the total transaction, the sale of Red Lobster from Darden to Golden Gate Capital, was about $2.1 billion. So really, CGC only had about $600 million of their own money in the deal. And real estate is a very stable and valuable asset, and is really your largest expense when it comes either your personal life or even in a business as well. So this was a significant burden that was now placed on Red Lobster. And the other problem is that now you're subject to having to negotiate these contracts with your landlord. And commercial is a little bit different. Typically when you rent your apartment, you're renting it for like a year, and then it goes on like a month lease after that. But in the world of commercial real estate, your lease is typically 3 to 4 years, and it's very structured. And I can't confirm, but my guess is that Red Lobster has what's called triple net leases or triple N leases with their properties, meaning that the owner is responsible for nothing. Typically, when you have an apartment, if the oven breaks, you call your landlord. If you get hurt on the property, you can sue your landlord. Like, that's how that works. But in the case of a triple net lease, you, the person leasing the property, is responsible for everything, creating another burden that you have to cover despite not having the value in your property. So I'm not sure what Red Lobster's numbers were at the time, but I still think that was a really crummy decision. Now, fast forward 2 years later, and one of Red Lobster's suppliers, called Thai Union, who was based out of Thailand, they're one of the seafood suppliers, they acquired a 25% stake in the company. Now, they have other brands to their name, such as like Chicken of the Sea and John West Foods, to name a few. They have more than that. Now, in 2016, they only paid $575 million for a 25% stake. Fast forward 4 years later, in the middle of 2020, and they actually decided to acquire the remaining stake that Golden Gate Capital owned. This created a significant conflict of interest, because now you have a company who has contracts with Red Lobster to be their supplier, and they're not their only supplier, but now they have control of the company. So Thai Union immediately put out a statement saying that we're not going to be involved in day-to-day operations of the company. We're going to maintain our existing relationships with our current suppliers. Things are going to be good. And as we'll see going forward, they didn't stay that rosy for that long. Now, right after their acquisition, the pandemic happens, and they see a significant decline in revenue. They have massive layoffs, and they're taking a big hit. However, in 2021, things began to come back. Red Lobster actually turned an operating profit at the beginning of 2021 in the first 6 months. They rehired 26,000 employees over that time, and they reported $2.3 billion in revenue for the year. Now, while that sounds great, that actually was down from 10 years prior, and they were still significantly down from prior to the pandemic. They had 30% fewer diners since 2019. That was written in the bankruptcy papers by the current CEO. And once the economy started to cool off, the company started seeing a dramatic decline in sales, with the CEO alleging in bankruptcy filings that Red Lobster took a $76 million loss in 2023. Once again, due to a sharp decline in sales for the year. Now, beyond this, all these former executives and former employees at the company contributed all these articles. And they were fired, right? So, they are kind of biased in what they contribute. So take some of this information with a grain of salt, but we're going to sort of try to break down what was going on at the company post-pandemic and see how we got to where we are. And to these former employees' credit, Red Lobster has had 5 different CEOs since 2019. So if you don't have continuity, you're not going to have success. And one of the things that these former employees and former executives allege immediately is that the new management made shrimp a significant part of Red Lobster's menu and increased their dependence on Thai Union to provide it, despite it not being in the best interest of the company. So that's one sort of bad decision that they said popped up. Another one, and this is probably the most incredulous one that I read, is that apparently after the pandemic was over, the reason that Red Lobster employees weren't called back into their relatively new headquarters that they opened in 2015 in Orlando wasn't because of remote work, but was because that Thai Union brought in a feng shui consultant who said that the offices had bad feng shui and that no one should use them. That is something that a former executive claimed Thai Union did. Now fast forward to 2022, and this guy named Paul Kenny, who was originally part of Thai Union's acquisitions team to acquire Red Lobster, he took over as CEO. Now Kenny is originally from Australia, and before being part of Thai Union was the CEO of Minor Food, one of Asia's largest casual dining and quick service restaurant chains. So he does have some experience. However, he abruptly fired the remaining management team at Red Lobster, and he also cut ties with two of Red Lobster's longest shrimp suppliers, something that Thai Union said they wouldn't do, but they're doing it here. And former executives claim that this was despite Thai Union not providing the best deal for seafood for Red Lobster. They just wanted to go with Thai Union because they wanted to. Now that was some of the back end stuff that Kenny did that started this sort of downward spiral of the business from that end. But at the same time, he also started making changes to the restaurants. Namely, Red Lobster had always offered a free side salad with your meal. He started charging for that. This started alienating and angering customers. There also was a significant decline in food at the restaurants. They eliminated the sauté station. Chefs started leaving tails on shrimp, which I guess is something that Red Lobster didn't do beforehand. And they also cut staff. So you had fewer cooks in the kitchen. And also typically you had one waiter would serve about 3 tables at a time. Now one waiter was expected to serve 10 tables. So a dramatic change. And probably the last significant change worth mentioning that Kenny made to the restaurants was that he made this limited time $20 endless shrimp promotion a permanent deal at Red Lobster. And this was bad for a couple reasons. One, he was told and warned multiple times, allegedly by these former executives that are in these articles, that $20 was not profitable for this deal. And on top of that, you have people at the restaurant just sitting at the table eating bowl after bowl of this endless shrimp, this underpriced shrimp. Meanwhile, you have people outside the restaurant waiting to get in. This is putting stress on staff, people trying to keep up with all the shrimp. Like, it just had a really bad impact to the restaurant experience. So after Kenny being CEO for about 2 years at this point, Thai Union announced that they were going to divest of their Red Lobster investment entirely, taking a $533 million loss. Now, they weren't announcing bankruptcy yet. This was in January of 2024. But really what they're saying is that, okay, we don't have the money to keep going. We know our books. We know this is not sustainable. Somebody please buy us to save us from bankruptcy. That is what this is saying. They're trying to avoid bankruptcy. And at this point, Red Lobster had posted $2.6 billion of revenue in 2023, which actually was the exact same as 10 years prior. And when you factor in inflation, I mean, this just means that same-store sales have been absolutely cratering. So in this period, Thai Union's trying to figure out what they're going to do. Is anybody going to step up and acquire Red Lobster for them? And really all they could do is that they started talking to their lenders, who they were trying to get them to buy 80% of the company, let Thai Union continue to manage it, but the lenders were having none of it. Discussions fell through. And so the only thing that the lenders were willing to do was provide about $20 million in loans to keep Red Lobster afloat, but they weren't willing to do any more than that unless Thai Union put up more money on their own, which apparently Thai Union was not willing to do. So talks break down, and 5 months later, Thai Union announces that Red Lobster is filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on May 19th, 2024, reporting assets of $1 billion and liabilities of $10 billion. And my guess is that the majority of that is probably unpaid rent. Now, as I stated at the beginning, Chapter 11 allows you to restructure your debt. Now, I'm not sure how it works at the corporate level, but like if you were personally to file bankruptcy and you file for Chapter 11, a judge will sit you down and say that, okay, here's all the assets you have, here's all the liabilities that you have, here's what the court thinks is the minimum amount of assets you need to survive, you're going to sell the rest. So like, if you have more than a certain percentage of equity in your home, they're going to force you to sell it. If you have more than a certain amount of equity in more than one car, you're going to be forced to sell the car. Any other things that can be sold for cash, the judge is going to force you to sell. Now, I'm not sure how that works at the corporate level, but as of their bankruptcy filing, Red Lobster employs 34,000 people in the US, 2,000 in Canada, and as part of their bankruptcy filing, they closed 93 underperforming stores, leaving about 550 left, and when Red Lobster was acquired by Golden Gate Capital, they had about 700. So in the last 10 years, they've closed about 150 restaurants, with 100 of those being within the last couple weeks or so. So obviously, Thai Union was not able to find a buyer when they announced they were going to divest of their investment 5 or 6 months ago at this point. So obviously, filing for bankruptcy doesn't make the investment that much more attractive. So I'm not sure if anybody's going to step forward and try to buy them now, but Red Lobster has stated that they're going to negotiate with this group called Fortress Investment Group, who specializes in bankruptcies and stuff, I guess. And they're going to put up $100 million of their own money to sort of support the chain, acquire it. But really what they're doing is what I read is called a stalking horse bid, which just sets the floor for what Red Lobster's assets are worth. And if they're going to keep it and try to grow the company, obviously, but if they get an offer that's better than the investment that they've put in, they're going to sell it to whoever that party is. So, like I said, I don't know if anybody comes forward and actually tries to buy this thing. I don't see why now it's any more attractive, but, who knows? You never know what's going to happen. As of now, Red Lobster's CEO is Jonathan Tibus. He specializes in restaurant chain restructuring. He most recently was the chief restructuring officer during the bankruptcy of Crystal, and was also the CEO of Kona Grill during their bankruptcy. So I guess look at where those companies are now, and Red Lobster's on a similar path. I don't know. My experience really is just, I've followed some of these companies that have gone through these private equity firms, and it feels like nothing really changes. Like, the restaurant still sticks around, but the quality significantly declines. And it sounds like Thai Union has already sort of done that. The restaurant quality's declined, they've cut staff. Obviously, Golden Gate made that terrible deal with the leases, because you have to imagine that through COVID and all the appreciation of real estate, the leases probably just skyrocketed. So hopefully inflation has run its course, and the lease and now some of the other costs that Red Lobster has can stabilize, and whoever is going to be running Red Lobster, this Jonathan guy, I guess, can sort of stabilize the business and at least return it to profitability and just go from there. That, to me, is probably what's going to happen. I really don't see Red Lobster going away. It's way too strong of a brand, and every time I drive by it, it's always packed. So I think Red Lobster is going to be fine, but it's going to be a shell of its former self, though. Really what I think is best is for them to go back into the umbrella of a larger company, whether it's General Mills or somebody else. Maybe it's Yum Brands, I don't know. Just, they need the resources and the time of a larger company who has a longer time horizon for their investments, has the resources to see the investment through. Anybody else who's smaller is just going to be in way too big of a rush to turn this thing around than what this actually needs. And I think macroeconomic conditions are having a significant impact on this business anyway. It's not totally to do with Red Lobster, but obviously there's things that could be fixed as well. So, with that being said, this has been an incredibly long video. Thank you for watching all the way through. If you did, I'm going to stop right here. Tell me what you think. Tell me if there's anything I missed that you would like to me have covered. If you want me to follow this in the future, also let me know that, because I really have no other way to gauge people's interest in this stuff. So, with that being said, I hope this was an interesting elaboration on this topic. Thank you for watching.